Hi, I'm Dr. David Dobson. Welcome to Conversations. Today we are joined by Dr. Stephanie Raible, an associate professor at the University of Delaware and a Fulbright scholar whose work focuses on how we think about entrepreneurship. Today we will discuss her research on the relatability gap and why the future of leadership is not about Silicon Valley unicorns, but about meaningful micro level impact. Stephanie, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to talk with you today.
Stephanie, we often forget that academics are intellectual entrepreneurs. Looking back on your journey to becoming a Fulbright scholar, what was your very first entrepreneurial spark as a young person that led you to this path?
Okay, so I'm going to talk about a very early one. So when I was about 9 or 10, I was in a class of kids, and it was around the age where birthday parties stopped being at the whole class level and they started getting more nuanced. So smaller groups of kids were being invited, and some kids were not being invited. And I remember very distinctly as a kid having one weekend where I felt really connected to my friends, and we were walking around a lake, and I saw cattails, which are this kind of plant growth that comes out of lakes. And I thought
Mhm.
to myself, like, oh, I feel so included in this moment. So when I went to school the next week, I proposed to start a club called the Cattail Club, where people could feel included in this kind of environment where people are being invited to the birthday party, so to speak. And I remember my teacher thought it was so cute that she sent me to the principal to actually propose this as a club. And she asked me to actually draw a picture of it. And so I did a one pager, handed it to the principal, and I think everybody thought it was adorable. Now, I did not have the social currency to pull off this club in any way and to get a lot of attendees coming in, but I kind of look back at that as something that really frames this kind of inclusive nature of wanting people to feel included in
Mhm.
spaces, but also having an enterprising nature where I want to bring people together
Mhm.
uh, in ways that didn't exist before.
Such a beautiful story. It's fascinating to hear how those early experiences shaped your path, Stephanie. In your work on relatability gap, you have explored how dominant media stereotypes often center on high growth, hack focused founders. In your experience, how do these narrow narratives discourage women and community minded individuals from entrepreneurship?
Yeah. Thank you for asking this question because I feel like this is something we don't talk enough about. So, stereotypes exist all across the media. They're things that we grew up with, and some people don't even know one entrepreneur in their life. They only know these media representations of entrepreneurs. So these are tend to be very successful, tend to be male or masculine energy. And what tends to happen is I've noticed through my research that if people are not necessarily seeing themselves in this type of career, they don't even know it's a possibility. And I'll give an example from my own life. I remember when I was in my 20s, I was really struggling to find a career path that felt authentic. And I remember speaking to a relative, and the relative basically said, I'm in a corporate world. You would never make it in a corporate world. You don't have
Mhm.
that kind of attitude. And I thought to myself, and I carried that narrative for
Mhm.
years. Nearly a decade, carried that narrative with me, saying, well, I'm not meant to be in the business space.
Mhm.
And it took a long time to kind of reframe that to say, well, there are
Mhm.
plenty of people in
Mhm.
business, and there are a lot of different voices in that space. And actually, funny enough, I've seen a lot of that through the research in terms of how people are associating within the entrepreneurial communities or not seeing them in this space.
Mhm. Yeah, it's very interesting you mentioned your relative mentioning. I wonder, is it because you are a woman, he said, or because he thought something else?
No, it was because I was too nice and kind, and
Yeah.
there was kind of this
Okay.
this perception that a lot of, but these are things that women are kind of trained,
Yeah.
raised to be kind and
Mm,
to be
mm,
relatable and to be
mm,
kind of stewards of
mm,
social
mm.
context, let's say, and keeping
Yeah.
peace. And I
Yeah.
feel like oftentimes that is contradictory to a lot of
Mm,
the things that we hear in business and
mm,
entrepreneurship circles, where you have to be
yeah.
ruthless and you have to be extroverted and you have to
Yeah.
be present. So yeah, it was more of a personality
Yeah. Yeah.
mismatch.
Stephanie, what is a specific lived experience in entrepreneurship that conventional business school narratives tend to obscure?
Yeah, I think this is a funny one because in my own writing of educational materials, I see this very clearly. So, in a recent example, I was writing a story about a social entrepreneur. So, social entrepreneurs are people that are looking to do a societal good, maybe coming from a sustainability perspective. And a lot of the social entrepreneurs I know often are just getting by. So they're so focused in on having community impact, environmental impact that sometimes the business functions go to the wayside. And I
Mm,
remember as I was creating a case study for the classroom, one of the reviewers came back and said, well, where are the financial statements and where are, all of these kind of like, what's the business plan? And I thought to myself, unfortunately, in a lot of these kind of more startup capacities, especially when we talk about
yeah,
solopreneurs, social entrepreneurs,
yeah,
oftentimes there's not financial modeling. There's not good
yeah.
traction of impact. In fact, sadly, the measurement of impact is one of the first things to kind of not happen. That
Mm,
is a really key piece of the picture.
mm,
So I know that we're trying to teach best practices in business schools
mm,
and trying to
yeah,
present the best possible ways, but
mm,
oftentimes what this does to students is kind of creates a
mm,
false narrative as to how entrepreneurship actually happens in the world. So unfortunately, I like to show my students that there are kind of some messier realities behind
yeah, yeah,
entrepreneurship. So
yeah,
yeah, there might not be financial statements,
yeah. No,
unfortunately.
this is wonderful. Your wonderful approach you have. So to combat these stereotypes, how can we change entrepreneurship education so it feels like an invitation to everyone rather than an exclusive club?
Yeah, I think a lot of this comes down to showing the breadth of people, topics, and lifestyles that are associated with entrepreneurship.
Mm,
Because when we think about the stereotype, it
mm,
kind of manifests at these different levels. So it's an individual level, it's the organizational level, and it's kind of the interaction between the two, the business and the individual.
mm,
So I think it's in showing the diversity of types of people. So that could be
mm,
demographic type things, it could be
mm,
personality, it could be even topical differences.
mm,
I think when we think about the organizational level, there's such a breadth of organizations that can cover entrepreneurial paths. And I think these types of organizations often don't get covered in the media. So being able to
mm,
see that there are, say, human-centered or kind of helping types of social enterprises, there are different types of businesses that are serving biomedical needs. So these are things that maybe aren't
mm,
first and foremost in
mm,
the media, but they're
mm,
things that exist in the world. And I
mm,
think also that intersection between the business and the individual, a lot of my students and younger people generally see entrepreneurship as something unattainable because they're like, well, I'd have to give up my life
mm,
for that, which that isn't necessarily the case. There are a lot of
mm,
people that are able to kind of fit entrepreneurship into the life that they want.
mm,
So it's kind of showing these different pieces of diversity within the scope of entrepreneurship that helps.
mm. Stephanie, if the goal is to make entrepreneurship an invitation for everyone, as you said, then we can also have to look at how we measure success. We often hear the bigger is better, but your work suggests that scaling and growth aren't actually the same thing. So,
Yeah.
what is the distinction between growing an organization and scaling impact so critical for social ventures? And what are the unique traps social ventures face?
Yeah, it's kind of hard because this goes back to a little bit of a chicken and egg problem. So growth is really thinking about the growth of the organization. So this could be adding additional staff members, kind of coalescing resources in a different way at an organizational level. When we talk about scaling, it's really thinking about the impact that the organization has. And
Mm,
I think part of what we don't recognize, especially when it comes to social ventures, is we keep thinking really about like scaling up. So thinking about how there's a kind of structural scaling, high growth kind of concept, whereas there are different ways to scale that can really deepen a relationship. So there's this concept, for example, of scaling deep that is thinking about like, well, you don't necessarily need more clients or customers or people within a considered target group to serve. You can actually just deepen your relationship and the types of things that you offer and the partnerships that you have. So I think
mm,
that there's often this like lofty goal of needing to
mm,
scale up, scale up, scale up, which kind of comes from traditional entrepreneurship. When we think
Mm,
about social entrepreneurship, that isn't always really the case. In
mm.
fact, we can probably sometimes better serve people by having a more deeper relationship with them than to kind of pass them off to someone else.
In your work on purpose-driven businesses, what have you found that traditional entrepreneurs can learn about successfully balancing financial responsibility with a deep community-based mission?
Yeah. I feel like I'll take this question and I'll kind of twist it a little bit.
Yeah.
So I think when it comes to what can traditional businesses learn, I think part of what it is I always give the guidance of do something that's authentic.
Mm,
I think people are really craving authenticity. So whether that's something that's mission aligned for the organization or something that really fits
mm,
into the local environment, if they're
mm,
more of a local business, I think that really adds a lot of value and reads as authentic. And I would just ask that they don't overclaim. I feel like
mm,
what tends to happen in these particular spaces is, especially in traditional entrepreneurship, there's kind of a want to impress.
mm,
And I think especially when you're comparing yourselves or maybe in the same ecosystem as social
mm,
enterprises and kind of community serving organizations, it's kind of dangerous to overclaim because not only can that be a potentially reputational risk if people find
mm,
out, but it's also kind of competing against others that may be trying to do a similar goal. So I think it's appropriate pick something mission aligned and
mm,
just be honest about the
mm.
outcomes.
Yeah, good point. You know, quite often we focus into the urban ecosystem because of bigger market, more opportunity. So if we focus on the rural ecosystem, how does the narrative of entrepreneurship change when we move away from urban hubs into rural resource-constrained environments?
Yeah, funny enough, this is something we just talked about in class maybe a couple weeks ago, so it's fresh in mind. For my students, well, in the informal survey of my students in the classroom, they actually felt like
Mm,
in studying these two types of contexts,
mm,
they felt like rural entrepreneurship was harder. I'm
mm,
inclined to agree with them because of three
mm,
things. So there's
mm,
really an identity perspective.
mm,
So is the entrepreneur an insider or an outsider, kind of in-group, out-group?
mm,
Will they be accepted within that community? There's
mm,
also an integration side of things. So
mm,
is the company itself or is the organization itself practicing entrepreneurship in the rural? So are they kind of just plopping a concept into a rural environment and not
mm,
adapting it? Or are they embracing a rural entrepreneurship itself? So are they really embedding themselves in the community and making themselves part of that ecosystem? And then I
mm,
would say the third side of things is thinking about like the unique challenges that come with being in a rural environment. So that can come from human capital,
mm,
kind of the integration of ecosystems. You might be missing pieces of an ecosystem that might exist more naturally and natively within the same area in an urban environment. And even things like logistics, like how
mm,
do people get to your physical location and how do you get really integrated into community when there's that really big spread? So
mm.
those are the three things that I've been thinking about.
Uh, the shift from urban hubs to rural ecosystem really highlights how diverse entrepreneurial landscape is, as you mentioned. However,
Oh yeah.
uh, even with the right environment, there is a personal hurdle, how we see ourselves. So I want to dive into this entrepreneurial identity, and I think you touched on that one,
Oh,
specifically for women who might not see themselves as founders in traditional sense. So how do women who do not primarily identify as founders navigate the transition into entrepreneurship while staying committed to sustainability?
yeah. Part of what's interesting about this is I've recently been looking into different titles with a
Mm,
couple of co-authors, and
mm,
our current work is actually highlighting the fact that there are women that are active entrepreneurs, they are founders, they are people that we would look at their trajectory and they just don't call themselves that. So I think one thing that we need to think about very clearly is if someone doesn't necessarily identify in the space, does that mean that they have some limitations to operating in the space? And this is kind of an area that we don't know about yet. I'm
mm,
imagining that when I'm speaking to these women that are operating in the space but don't call themselves these things,
mm,
it could potentially limit what kind of networking opportunities they go towards, maybe
mm,
what kind of funding, grants, it's a possibility. It's
mm,
not something that we've gone down that path yet, but when we think about this as well, a lot of people don't see themselves as entrepreneurs to begin with
Mm,
because of some of the stereotypes that are existent beyond that point. So there are kind of these dual hurdles of getting over that entrepreneurial intention gap. So can we get someone to see themselves as potentially having entrepreneurial intentions, and then from that next entrepreneurial action side of things? So can we get someone from that being interested in the entrepreneurial space, accepting it as a broader space, but then
mm,
also kind of navigating into the space and attempting it. So
mm,
yeah, it's a little bit tricky. So we have kind of this dual identity jump.
mm. Interesting. Stephanie, I want to talk about the role of case studies. So why is the choice of protagonist in business cases so vital for students' sense of belonging in the field?
Yeah. I think this goes back to understanding that case studies are supposed to show real
Mm,
people and
mm,
real organizations.
mm,
I think oftentimes when I look in business schools and a lot of highly adopted cases, my critique is a lot of them are large corporations, they're established
mm,
organizations, and they almost show a protagonist that is bigger than life.
mm,
So sometimes they'll show someone who has a big personality. There are a lot of men in case studies as well that tend to be these protagonists, but interestingly, I remember in a review process when I was displaying a woman who was being very vulnerable in her approach to things in a good way to kind of
mm,
say that, there was a point in time where she was trying to work through an issue
mm,
where she knew that she was coming in with a faulted perspective. And
mm,
she's like, I know I'm doing this wrong and I need to do something better. And one of the reviewers in the process actually came back and said, isn't that reckless of her to be presenting this? And at the same time, I thought, every student that I've tested this with actually said, that's really honest of her. And there's a
mm,
refreshing sense of honesty in that
mm,
picture. And I think that that makes them much more human. And students then realize like, oh, I don't have to come in with all the right answers. I don't have to know
mm,
everything.
mm,
And I actually like showing people for the humans that they are versus kind of these perfect
mm,
people that they might want to present themselves
mm.
as.
Yeah, good point. I want to talk about briefly on the global perspective. Based on your international work, is the pressure to conform to dominant models of entrepreneurship a uniquely American phenomena or a global one?
Yeah, I wish I could say it was just us in the States, but I feel like there's kind of a multi-layer to this as well. So
Mm,
I think in the States we have a very dominant
mm,
um, stereotype when it comes to entrepreneurship. And in fact, when you look at American Shark Tank, which is a TV show that deals with entrepreneurs and pitching, versus Dragon's Den, which they have a UK version and a Canadian version, all of these things, especially when you compare how the sharks or the dragons
mm,
interact with the people, you
mm,
see a huge cultural distinction between the two.
yeah.
One is in the UK and Canada, I see it as much more formative
Mm,
feedback and
mm,
encouraging sometimes, whereas in the US, there's this fanfare around kind of this boldness. And that's, I think, it goes to show that you could interpret that as the American context having a stronger stereotype, but
mm,
unfortunately, in my experiences, there are other facets that really come forward. So in the European context, I was interviewing a lot of women entrepreneurs, and they say, don't be fooled
mm,
about some of the kind of gendered perspectives that you hear that things are better.
mm,
On that side of the pond, I feel like they were saying there's a lot of gendered senses of when you go into entrepreneurial
mm,
circles that they feel that distinction of that they're the minority. They're really coming into a world that isn't their own when
mm,
they bridge into entrepreneurship. So there
mm,
is that sentiment as well that exists
mm,
in Europe and the European context I've studied.
mm,
But when looking even at other facets that kind of pair with entrepreneurship, there are
mm,
cultural and religious views of things like disability. I've spent
mm,
some time in Thailand where we were looking at the intersection between
mm,
disability and entrepreneurship. And even just having some of those notions of people of how they might identify themselves within a disability focused
mm,
community also prohibited them from being in an entrepreneurial community because there are some startup funds that are earmarked towards those individuals. So it's funny how kind of this multi-layer of identity. So
mm,
whether it's gender and entrepreneurship or disability and entrepreneurship, there are things that kind of still manifest into having a dominant model of entrepreneurship that maybe doesn't fit those molds.
right. Stephanie, it's nice that you've been pushing for a more localized, meaningful definition of success. Can we talk about value of micro label impact and what that looks like in practice? Uh, how can we rethink impact of meaningful localized change rather than just a massive scale?
Yeah. So this taps into an essay that was created between Tina Mietag, Marlene Varenga, and myself. We have been talking about this for years as academics about how there's this kind of bigger than one individual concept when we
Mm,
look to some of the latest, greatest folks that are doing impact related work, community-based work, consulting with different businesses through their research. It's really intimidating the scale of which they're able to accomplish in terms of impact. And so the three of us as early stage researchers were kind of talking about this and talking about the history even back as early as our doctoral programs and navigating how we kind of felt intimidated by this notion of impact. But I think that this actually also maps to everyday people as well. When we think about impact, we often think that we have to change a whole community, change a whole organization. We have to have systemic level change. But in reality, like most of us are just going to have sometimes individual level impact, and we have to value the I guess the opportunity of that, as well as how impactful that is for that individual. So kind of to see the scale and appreciate the scale of even at the individual level can bring a lot into the picture.
mm, yeah, good point. Uh, Stephanie, for our listeners who are currently working in a traditional profit-first companies but want to start shifting their culture towards a community purpose model, what is one micro impact step they can take this week or whenever they could without needing a massive budget?
Yeah. I think that there are little things that organizations can do, and this is highly dependent on a company's business model. It's highly dependent on a lot of factors.
Mm,
I think the one thing that would be appropriate is to think about like the Tom's shoes warning, let's say. Don't let the business model of what you want to create inadvertently overshadow the impact that you want to have. So what
mm,
happened with Tom's Shoes as a really famous example, they did a one-for-one program, and
mm,
that's what they were best known for. And they
mm,
were really the one to bring that model to a scale that was enticing for other organizations to adopt that. Unfortunately, that one-for-one model ended up kind of taking its impact in a direction that was potentially unintended, that had
mm,
local consequences. It also
mm,
had kind of sustainability consequences as well.
mm,
So it kind of affected both the social and the
mm,
sustainability elements that they were trying to bring forward in the business. So all to say that when we're thinking about an organization that wants to bring a community purpose model to the work that they're doing, it's
mm,
kind of the warning of don't oversimplify things and always measure what's happening, because I think oftentimes there's best of intentions in a model that you want to bring forward, but it doesn't always yield the impact that you want to have. So just being conscious to monitor the impact along the way and to be open to seeing things that are potentially negative consequences that were unintended.
right. Yeah. Stephanie, let's talk about a little bit ethics and leadership. How can entrepreneurs integrate a framework of universal ethics without losing their competitive edge in a move fast and break things culture?
Yeah, I have to laugh at this because I think there's like the move fast and break things culture is something that is really, really key to that stereotype of kind of making sure that and stereotypes aren't just demographic
Yeah.
differences, but they're
Mm,
also even things like personality and
mm,
approach towards things. Like we do think that we need to build a plane as we're flying it. And
mm,
while there's some truth to kind of making sure
mm,
to test the grounds, I think there's always that place for reflection to say, like,
mm,
how do I also slow myself down at the same time to say, am I doing the right thing?
mm,
What kind of impact am I having in my
mm,
work? What kind of impact am I having on my employees or
mm,
on the people that I work with, the other stakeholders
mm,
in the picture? And so I think that
mm,
it's just allowing yourself that slowdown, I think is key, because what ends up happening is I think in entrepreneurial culture, there is this move fast, break things kind of
mm,
approach. But at the same time, I think it's not getting caught up in that and to find intentional moments where you can say, at this point, I'm going to reflect on, what is actually happening in the picture. And having that as an honest approach, I think is really refreshing as well. It's not always popular because when you're looking for funding, when you're looking for like accolades and that kind of thing, that slowdown is not always welcome. And also
Mm,
the openness to kind of recognize what's actually happening versus what is ideally happening isn't
mm,
always what people want to see. But I
mm,
think when we think about the ethical leadership approach to things, it's something that you have to do.
yeah. I love your idea of micro actions because it makes ethical leaderships feel achievable for everyone. So to wrap up our conversation, I want to zoom out and look at the big picture for next generation of entrepreneurs. Uh, how do you hope the way we teach and value entrepreneurship in our university will evolve so that every student, every entrepreneurial student, regardless of their background, feels both invited and equipped to lead?
Yeah. I kind of feel like this needs to be a multi-tier approach. First of
Mm,
all, I think it's important for, regardless of where the entrepreneurship
mm,
center or department sits, whether it's within a business school, whether it's kind of broader within the
mm,
university, I think it's important to have outreach. I
mm,
actually, when I started my position at University of Delaware, I was actually situated between two departments in two different colleges very intentionally because we were looking to bridge into those
mm,
spaces.
mm,
And so part of our initiative in becoming a school next year is we're actually going to have the opportunity to kind of be more reaching into different areas of the university. So I think part of it is intentionally doing that outreach to meet the students where they are, because oftentimes there are students that are like me. When I was a university student, I was not in the business school,
mm,
that wouldn't have found entrepreneurship, even though I was very enterprising as an undergraduate. I was someone who was starting clubs. As someone who graduated, I ended up starting a lot of initiatives, but I would never find myself in that space. So I think it's intentional to go to students where students are. Like I recently gave a talk for something that was within human development and family sciences, and a lot of those students would probably never, I asked them, have you ever been to anything related to entrepreneurship? And the universal answer was no. So a
mm,
lot of it is just introducing the fact that it is possible for a diverse group of students. And I think also from a faculty member standpoint or a staff member who's doing that outreach to be approachable. This
mm,
kind of goes back to that human level of things. I think
mm,
there's a lot of things that we needed to debunk from the stereotypes because, again, a lot of students don't know an entrepreneur, they don't know business owners, they only know it from what they see in the media. So a lot of it is if you are their first person that they're meeting in that space, how can you make this more attainable, more human, and just more approachable for them to come
mm.
into the ecosystem? So yeah, it's just a lot of intentional kind of going to people and bringing people into the space through that relatability piece.
Daphne, thank you so much for sharing your insight on entrepreneurship today. It's a pleasure having you.
Thank you for having me, and hope everybody gets to try something entrepreneurial at some point. It's a lot of fun.